welcome. It's Jackie from Cambridge Safety. Welcome to one of our Take 5 Minutes for Health and Safety videos. This is one of our series on the variety of different risk assessments that you might need to do as an employer. In this particular one, we're going to just take 5 minutes to remind ourselves of the fundamentals of the control of substances, hazardous to health risk assessment, where we've got hazardous substances. So COSHH, the Control of Substances Hazardous to Health, Regulation 6. Employers must not carry out work which is liable to expose any employee to any substance hazardous to health unless a suitable and sufficient assessment has been made of the risks to the health of employees and the steps that they then need to take to meet the regulations. Not an amazingly well drafted and nice clear, but it's basically saying, right, don't expose people to hazardous substances until you've done a suitable and sufficient assessment and you've looked at the things that you need to do to ensure that they're used safely. So firstly, what is a hazardous substance? COSHH helps us. It could be a liquid, a gas, a vapor or solid. That includes aerosols, mists. So it's not just powders, it's the range of different forms of a hazardous substance. If you've got a substance, a liquid with one of the new global harmonization systems, as we can see here, it's automatically going to be a hazardous substance. If it's listed in EH40, where it lists workplace exposure limits, the amount that you and I can be exposed to in a typical 8-hour day or 15-minute period. Any human pathogens and biological agents, particularly relevant at the moment. Any dust, but my nice all-encompassing, which is within the regulations then, and any other substance arising from work which may be hazardous to health. We're going to talk about an assessment here related to a chemical rather than biological agents, but you're right if you think that, yeah, COSHH does cover biological agents as well, but we're going to look at chemicals. A suitable and sufficient risk assessment. So we might do a basic assessment for our standard cleaning chemicals and things like that. We might do a more in-depth assessment where we've got maybe chemicals that are carcinogens or mutagens and have specific ill health conditions. And we might do a very in-depth specialist risk assessment where we might have something like wood dust, or you've got mixtures of chemicals where you've got to make a more in-depth assessment. So it could start very basic, or it could be more in-depth depending on the risk level, suitable and sufficient. Higher the risk, more detail; lower the risk, less. Our COSHH assessment, we need to make sure that we cover a range of different issues. So we'll start, I've put them under 4 headings: the substance, use, environment and person, because if you've got some headings, you can then think about the things that you might need to consider. So we'll look at the substance itself first of all. What's its form? Is it a mixture? What are the ill health effects? Its classification. Is it used on its own? Is it mixed with something else? Does it have any chronic effects or any acute effects? Does it have any synergistic effects where it mixes with something else and creates a different product? So look at the substance first, the form, any workplace exposure limits. But the substance on its own is not the COSHH assessment. We need to look at the use, because the use could impact on the risk level. What are you actually using it for? How much of it are you using? How frequently? How are you applying it? Are you spraying it? Are you dipping it? Are you chucking it? You know, how much of the substance are we being exposed to? The substance and the use. But don't forget the environment, the workplace or the area where the substance is being used. If it's being used outdoors, then there tends to be a lower risk of exposure than if it's being used in a small, poorly ventilated area. If the lighting is not very good, that could increase the risk. If the atmosphere is hot or humid, or the floor's uneven. So these, again, looking at our suitable and sufficient, it's not just about the substance, it's the substance, how we're using it, where we're using it. And finally, we've got the person. Who is at risk? Obviously, we've got the individual. Is it just the person using it, or is it other people in the near vicinity? Have we got anybody who's at greater risk? Maybe someone who already suffers from asthma, somebody who's got a disability, somebody perhaps who's pregnant or is breastfeeding, a young person. How many people are exposed? Is it just one who we can look after, or is it actually the whole of the factory, a few hundred people? we've also got to consider that certain people in certain circumstances could be at greater risk. So in terms of our suitable and sufficient, the more questions we ask, the more bits of information we obtain, the more valid our assessment is going to be. Once we've looked at all of that, we can look at what are our existing controls, what are we already doing that is helping to reduce the risk of injury. Are we providing some personal protective equipment? Have we got a local exhaust ventilation system? Then taking all of that into account, we're looking at evaluating the risk. Now, for a COSHH assessment, we don't normally need a 6x6 grid or lots of numbers. You've got to take all of the data that you've been able to obtain on the substance and its use, and then taking into account the existing controls are in place. Is it then exposure is likely to be minimal, or the substance itself creates a minimum hazard? Is it totally contained, so our evaluation might be low? Or is it we're using a lot of the substance, it's a carcinogen, it can splash onto people's skin, therefore our evaluation is going to be high? What we're really looking at is high, medium and low. Are our existing controls adequate? Do we need to implement some additional controls? Or actually have we got to do something major because the risk is unacceptable? So don't get too bogged down using numbers. It's making a judgment based on all the information that we've been able to obtain. Once we've done that, a separate legal requirement within COSHH, Reg 6 is do the risk assessment. Reg 7 is then ensuring that we take steps to either prevent or control the risk reasonably practicable. The higher the risk, we do more. Lower the risk, we do less. Once we've implemented our new controls, we need to record our assessment if we have 5 or more employees, and we're recording our significant findings, the substance, who's at risk, the form, the classification of the substance, our existing controls and our new controls. Monitoring and reviewing, similar but different. Monitoring is, we said we were going to do this to control this substance. Have we done it? Is it working? Reviewing is then at a suitable interval, maybe a year or 6 months or even 2 years. We look at the risk assessment as a whole and say, is this still valid? Are we still using this substance in this way? Is the classification the same? Has anything changed that either increases the risk level or reduces it? So we've got a number of steps to enable us to carry out a suitable and sufficient COSHH assessment. So starting point for your COSHH assessment, consider what activities do you carry out at work which either use or generate hazardous substances. Review the current use of substances, have labels on packaging and any safety data sheets that you've got. Identify the substances that are very low risk. So, your washing up detergent, your photocopier toner, that can of air freshener that you've got in the toilets, they are still hazardous substances, but you don't need to write a 5-page COSHH assessment on them. So you can identify those that you believe are low risk, and you can just keep a basic record to show that you have considered them and the risk is low. Then we've got a basic COSHH assessment that you might do an individual assessment on the substances that you've got, maybe some of the cleaning agents that you use, etc. Then we've got our more detailed assessment, particularly for carcinogens and mutagens, and we might then have a very more specialist risk assessment where you've got something like wood dust, where you've got to do a lot of an analysis before you can actually do your assessment. But whatever your assessment is making sure that you communicate the findings, you put in place steps to review that risk assessment. But the most important thing is, if you say you need to implement some additional controls, make sure that those controls are actually implemented, and then you check, make sure that they've been followed through. So thank you very much. A 5-minute tour on the control of substances hazardous to health and COSHH assessments. This is Jackie Cambridge from Cambridge Safety. Thanks for watching.